My name is Linton Brooks. I have been involved with nuclear weapons policy for much of my adult life, sometimes in the military, sometimes as part of our government. I was the chief negotiator for the first START treaty in 1991, and most recently I spent 5 years running the National Nuclear Security Administration, which is our weapons program and some of our non-proliferation work. I think they've always been there. I was a schoolboy when the first weapons were used in Japan, and in the 50s, there was a great deal of science fiction, speculative fiction around nuclear weapons. And so I think I've always vaguely been aware of them. My first professional contact was in 1959 on my first ship, when we were evaluating a system that was designed to carry nuclear weapons, although we didn't actually have any on board yet. I was on both kinds of submarines, both the kinds that carry ballistic missiles, so-called strategic missiles, and then also attack, or sometimes called hunter-killer submarines. The attack submarines of those days also had nuclear weapons on board, but they were for tactical use. They were for attacking other ships. Most of the time, it's really boring. I mean, that's the whole point, is nothing's supposed to happen. I was, however, on patrol during the Suez Crisis when we raised our alert readiness. And I think the whole point of your training is to make all of that routine. So you're focusing on professionalism and carrying out your responsibilities. Our approach in the United States, and I think this is true for other countries as well, is that the political leadership makes decisions about nuclear weapons, and we don't want individual ships trying to decide whether to follow the president's orders. And so we practice a great deal so that when something happens, there's a routine and we follow it. Obviously, in the one or two times where there was tension, you think about the consequences, but it's not. I think people who haven't done this think of it as, you're always thinking about the apocalypse. You're not thinking about the apocalypse. You're thinking about training. You're thinking about whether some particular sailor can be trained and promoted to a next rate, and you're thinking about whether you have time to take a shower before you go on watch. And it's a routine business, but with a very high standard of professionalism. I was on one of the destroyers enforcing the quarantine, and our only claim to fame is that the day they decided that they needed to put some press pictures out, so they flew some reporters out on a Navy aircraft, and they took pictures of an intercept, and that particular intercept was my ship. But it has nothing. I mean, we were one of many ships doing a job, but I've got the picture somewhere. I think that it's obviously the closest the world has ever come to a nuclear exchange. I think it showed that the political leadership in both the Soviet Union and the United States was sober and creative and not at all eager. It showed, and that's a good thing. It also, however, shows the limits of intelligence. We now know that there were tactical weapons in Cuba, and we now know that if they had not been able to contact Moscow and thought that they were about to be overrun, they had some kind of authority, and I've not studied the details, to use them. We did not know that, well, certainly at my level, I was a junior officer, but I don't think Americans generally knew that at the time. So I think what we take out of that is the importance of thoughtful and creative leadership, and the skepticism that we have to apply to intelligence. There's a myth in Hollywood movies that the American intelligence, the American CIA knows everything. And time again, we see where they just didn't. They didn't know about that. They didn't know, we didn't recognize some things later in the Cold War. Obviously, the Iraq War, whether history judges it a good idea or a bad idea, there was a huge amount of faulty intelligence at the beginning, and so I think what lessons I take is it's good that you have political leadership making decisions, not just military, and it's good that political leaders generally are skeptical about what technical experts tell them, because, and I'm a technical expert basically, but technical experts can be wrong. Layers and organizations and procedures are not a substitute for good judgment, but they can help. They can help make sure that presidents are shown multiple options, and so you need procedures that encourage people to look beyond their first guess. But still, the best way, the best way not to have a president do something stupid is to elect a smart president. I mean, and that's true for all countries. We were, at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, very fortunate, as it turns out, that both Kennedy and Khrushchev were responsible. Oh, there's nothing remotely that close. One of the things that I think most Americans did not recognize during the Cold War, if you look back and you read Cold War speeches from Soviet leaders, they would say things like, someday NATO will attack us. And everybody in the West thought that had to be propaganda, because we knew NATO had no intention of attacking us. Some years it's hard enough to get NATO to agree on to hold a meeting, let alone to decide to attack. But after the Cold War, I think we have come to realize that they really believed it. The things that we thought were propaganda, they really believed. And so, for example, in the early 80s, I don't remember, 83 maybe, was a time when the rhetoric between the Soviet Union and the United States was pretty harsh on both sides. You know, the time of the evil empire speech. There was a routine exercise called Able Archer. And we now know that at least some senior Soviets thought that it was a cover for a surprise attack. And that never occurred, best of my knowledge, that never occurred to any American to think that. So I think that what those sort of things tell you is the importance of trying to have the two sides understand one another. In my not quite retirement, I spend a lot of time on discussions on nuclear issues with the Russian Federation, with the People's Republic of China. And some of what we're doing are things that it's inconvenient for the governments to do, but what we're really trying to do is deepen our understanding of each other, so that there won't be misinterpretations in the future. And I think nothing remotely close to where we were in the Cuban Missile Crisis, but Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't the only time of tension. This is an American perspective, and when you talk to my Russian colleagues, I think you will get a different perspective. So I think for Americans, the military part of the Cold War is over. I'm not sure that's true for the Russians. If you look at the 2010 military doctrine, and you look at the main threats to the Russian Federation, and doctrine's important in their system. If you look at the main threats, about half of them are very clearly associated with NATO and the United States. And so I think that the Cold War's, the military aspects of the Cold War are clearly over on the U.S. side. I mean, there's still a lot of tension with Russia where I think the American government is concerned that the Russian state is becoming more and more authoritarian, but nobody thinks this is remotely a return to the Soviet Union. Nobody thinks this is remotely a return to the Cold War. When I read some of the Soviet military writings, it's not as clear to me that they think that the Cold War is over. They wouldn't use the words Cold War, but the suspicion that we are an enemy and a military threat, I think, is still embedded in some influential thinking. There's now relations between countries tend to have multiple dimensions because there's also a tremendous amount of cooperation that goes on. With China, I don't think Cold War is the right term, because I think after the United States recognized that the so-called Sino-Soviet split, the period in which China became a rival for leadership in the communist world rather than a subordinate. I don't think we thought of China in pure Cold War terms, or the same way we did. I think with China, China is a rising power, and the Chinese, or some Chinese, believe that the United States wants to prevent it from taking its rightful place in the world. Americans think that the Chinese view of their rightful place may be a place in which the United States has no influence in the Pacific. And since that's been for over a century a very important part of America's grand strategy, if we had a grand strategy, we don't use those kind of words. I think we're seeing a tension about how to manage the rise of China in a way that doesn't threaten the traditional American view about its geopolitical role. I think that with the Russian Federation, nuclear weapons still matter. I think American security experts in the next 20 years will spend a huge amount of time on China. But I don't think it'll be on nuclear. I think it's asymmetric warfare, it's cyber warfare, it's economics, it's space. China's clearly decided to establish itself as a major space power. And there'll be a great deal of cooperation and competition that'll have to be managed. I think that the nuclear weapons dimension of that is not the most important dimension. Now, there are a number of Americans who don't agree with that. There are a number of Americans who worry about Chinese nuclear modernization. I don't particularly worry about it. I think it's, they appear to be trying to preserve a minimal deterrent, not to build some massive capability. And I think there's a lot more to worry about militarily with the Chinese than their nuclear program. These are almost platitudes. If I had really good answers, I'd probably be back in government. The United States, I think, genuinely wants to see China play an important role in global security. But we're not prepared to have China replace the United States. The United States is unusual geopolitically in the number of global allies it has. And people will argue whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but most American national security professionals place a great deal of importance on carrying out our commitments to states that look to us to help with their security. NATO is an obvious example, but China, South Korea, Australia, the Philippines. And so we don't want to see China's rise handled in a way that appears to threaten their neighbors. And we don't want to see China's rise handled in a way that would make it impossible for the United States to come to the assistance of those neighbors if it became necessary. So what's needed on the Chinese side is to work with us to find a way so that, you know, their continued involvement doesn't turn into some kind of attempt to impose a new regime. On the U.S. side, we are a little bit divided. Ballistic missile defense has become a very hot topic in the last 20 years. And it's always been very contentious in the United States, and I would argue that right now there is clear agreement between the two political parties across the ideological spectrum that ballistic missile defense against states like North Korea and Iran is both feasible and necessary. There's similar consensus that ballistic missile defense that can deny the Russians the ability to retaliate against the United States is not strategically sensible and not technically possible. With China, there are Americans who think China is a small Russia, that in fact they do have the ability to retaliate in a small way against the United States, and we can't do anything about it. And there are others who believe that if we spent the money, we could do something about it, and that it's shameful that we don't because we're leaving the American people vulnerable. Until we know what we think, we're not going to be able to convince the Chinese of what we think. And so I think that what is needed on our side is to decide just how we want to manage the undeniable fact that the Chinese are developing a small but capable force. And, you know, is this something that we treat the way we treat the Russians? That is, you will not attack us because it would be suicidal for you to do so? Or is this something that we treat the way we treat the North Koreans, saying, I don't know how you think, but if you think attacking us is a good idea, we will destroy the missiles. You will not be able to attack us, and oh, by the way, you'll still leave yourself open to retaliation. And so I think that if we're going to manage the rise of China, we're going to have to decide really what we think. My own view is we're going to see for all of my lifetime a degree of competition and a degree of cooperation with China. I mean, you know, economics matter a lot, and we are intertwined with China economically. China's obviously their growth will slow because they're at the part where growth tends to go up, and then you reach a point where it's harder and harder to more. And there's still an awful lot of people in China who have not benefited from the economics, rural China particularly. But generally, China is going to be hugely important economically. I don't think that the only thing we have to do this century with China is get the economics right. I think getting the economics right will help, but it won't guarantee that there won't be conflict, because we've also got to get the strategy and the policy right. Both the Russians and the Americans have been reducing their total stockpile. An example, the George W. Bush administration, which was not thought of globally as a particularly dovish administration, cut the stockpile exactly in half, from 10,200 to 5,100. And essentially that was unrelated to arms control. That was the president, and the president was involved in those decisions, reducing what he saw as excess. So I think you've seen France shrink, you've seen Britain shrink. I think the older nuclear powers are all reducing. The US and Russia tend to want to do that through agreements, but I think the pressure for reductions is not entirely driven by the agreements. The balance between the Russian Federation and the United States is important in terms of US-Russian relations, but it's also important because, as long as we're looking at multiple thousands, it's going to be very hard it's harder to mobilize the world to prevent proliferation when the traditional nuclear powers, particularly I think the Russian Federation and the United States, are at very high levels. I believe that the next agreement should focus on warheads. All arms control agreements up to now have focused really on delivery systems, missiles, bombers. And sometimes, as in the treaty I negotiated, they talk about warheads, but the way they get those numbers is they count missiles and then multiply by a number. I think that we need to have an agreement with the Russian Federation that focuses on warheads. That does two things. For us, it's a way to bring in tactical weapons where Russia, by most accounts, has a substantial edge. For the Russians, it's a way to deal with what they call upload potential. The way the United States has done its reductions is to keep the missiles and take some of the warheads off. Those warheads still exist, so presumably they could be put back on. The Russians have tended to reduce missiles. And so their missiles are all carrying the maximum number of warheads. So if they want to increase, they have to go build more missiles, dig more silos. Whereas, the United States took warheads off and can put them back on. That can't be done overnight, but it can certainly be done in a fairly short period of time. So we've got all these reserve warheads that the Russians don't have. So if you have a warhead agreement, that is a good way to deal with something that they're worried about, to deal with something that we're worried about. Now, that poses some technical challenges because warheads aren't very big. I mean, you know, a warhead, depending, is, well, certainly there are warheads in our stockpile that the four of us could carry, or maybe two of us. So if you're going to count those, you probably need some new technology. What I would like to see is that technology developed jointly by the Russian Federation and the United States. Because I think that you're more likely to have states accept technology that they had a hand in developing. And that would improve scientific cooperation, which I think has benefits. So that's the approach I'd like to see. I'm not the only one in the United States who wants to see it. It's not clear. The Russians at the moment show no interest in having a discussion until we resolve the question of missile defense in Europe. And right now, what the Russians mean by resolve is for us to accept limits that neither this administration nor a Republican administration would accept, and that the Senate wouldn't ratify if they were limited. So until we find a way to roll that rock out of the road, I think it's going to be a while until we have another agreement. There'll be another agreement sometimes because New START will expire, and the Russians and the Americans, for that matter, don't want there to be no agreement. They want there to be something. But New START doesn't expire for a while, so the Russians, I mean, I don't think, for example, I know that people say the president wants to get another arms control agreement, and I'm sure he does, but he's not going to, in my view. I think it's very unlikely the Russians are going to be ready to talk in the near future. Now, my colleagues who are responsible for American arms control policy would be more upbeat than I am. I think you have to look at that country by country. First of all, the next step with the Russian Federation should be bilateral. I think everybody agrees with that. People will occasionally say something about China, but they're really looking for an excuse not to make progress in it. The next step should be bilateral because we're still, if you look at total stockpile, we're still 10 times bigger than anybody else, and the Russians. So there's at least one more step and maybe two more steps. What the Chinese say is that we have to get down somewhere in the range of their total weapons, so a few hundred. That's going to be a while. The British would, I think, be willing to participate in discussions. The French historical position has been, don't call us, we'll call you. And I don't think that the French government and French strategic experts think this is an interesting question. And then with India and Pakistan, we have a problem because we tend to think in terms of the states that are legitimized under the NPT, but you probably can't go to a global regime without doing something about India and Pakistan, and the Chinese probably would not be terribly thrilled if you did. So I think the answer probably is to try and bring the states that possess nuclear weapons into other kinds of arrangements. In other words, the P5 are doing some things now, glossaries and looking at verification to fulfill commitments they made in the 2010 non-proliferation review conference. Well, you need a mechanism like that that involves, I would argue, the P5 plus India and Pakistan. And I argue that that's the group because the international community doesn't recognize the legitimacy of North Korea. You know, my country has very strong views about Iran, but they haven't done anything yet. And I think Israel is such a special case, and it would be so hard. I mean, we've just seen the WMD free zone discussions collapse, that Israel does not acknowledge that it has things, and if it has nuclear weapons, which very many people believe, it really doesn't have anything to do with the other nuclear weapon states. It has to do with being surrounded by countries that some of whom at some times in their history have said Israel should be driven into the sea. And so I think Israel's a special case. Sooner or later you have to deal with it. But for the next step, I would try and get some stuff going on, discussions on doctrine, discussions on safety, among the seven. I think that would be the appropriate thing. I think we are so far away from being ready to involve anybody other than Russia and the United States in formal, numerically limited arms control, the kind of stuff that I used to do for a living, then it's not productive to try and think about how that would happen, because if it's going to happen 20 years from now, which I think is probably the right time frame. You know, our track record as a species and my track record as an individual of looking ahead 20 years is not very good. So I think it'll be clearer about how we approach this when we get closer to it. Ronald Reagan spent a lot of the 1980s quoting a Russian phrase which translates to trust but verify. And while General Secretary Gorbachev got annoyed because he said it all the time, I think my country has internalized that phrase. I think the United States will not be interested in unverifiable treaties. Now, we're party to some unverifiable treaties. The Biological Weapons Convention is widely considered to be unverifiable. The United States did a formal assessment and concluded that they couldn't verify it. Furthermore, as you go smaller and smaller, now we're into that 20 years from now, as you go smaller and smaller, cheating matters more. If the Russians have 100 warheads today that we don't know about, makes absolutely no difference. Absolutely no difference. If we get down to 300 warheads and the Russians have 100 warheads that we don't know about, it makes a little difference. If we get down to 5 warheads and the Russians have 100 warheads we don't know about, it makes a really big difference. So I think that what you will see is we're going to have to find a way to continue to make progress on verification. I'm going to argue tomorrow at the conference I'm speaking at here that that will have a technical component, that verification is not just procedures, that there's technology, and that the world should be trying to develop that. So I think that any real progress in weapons reductions will have to be verifiable, because think about it, there's no arms control agreement between the United States and Britain. But, you know, Britain could pretty much devastate my country. But we're not worried about that. You have arms control agreements with people that you're not sure, maybe they're not enemies, but you're not sure they're friends. You're not sure you trust them. And arms control is a way to provide stability by letting you know what they are doing. And that means it has to be verifiable. And I think that's really going to be hard. It's hard now, but it's going to be hard as we get to lower levels, and it's going to be hard as we get to more countries. I mean, you know, the human mind can think of sound technical verification regimes on a global basis. CTBT, notwithstanding its difficulties in coming into force, but it has a, you know, it has a very sophisticated verification regime. I guess I think future arms control is going to look a lot more like that than like the Biological Weapons Convention. It is good in that it uses multiple technologies. It is good that it depends on an international organization, so it's less likely to be bent to the will of one of the superpowers. Same benefits we get out of the IAEA. The problem in the United States is that the United States uses a phrase called effective verification. And what that means is nobody believes that you can ensure that everything is always being done exactly the way a treaty says. But what you can ensure is that if somebody is violating it, you will know in time to act before it affects the military balance. And everybody in the United States sort of, I mean, we all phrase it a little differently, but we use the word effective verification, and that's what it means. Now let's look at the CTBT, because it's a good example. There is good agreement in the technical community about what the CTBT can detect, what the CTBTO, International Monitoring System, can detect. And everybody understands there's something that can be done that's undetectable. I mean, in the view of the United States, although the treaty does not define nuclear test, if it releases energy, it's a nuclear test. And clearly there are things that release, you know, I don't know, 50 pounds of energy that cannot be detected remotely. So if you can detect down to very low levels, is that effective verification? Well, it depends on what you believe a state could do below those levels. No one has ever been able to give me an example of something the Russians or the Chinese might be able to do without being detected that would alter the military balance in any significant way. That's where I think the facts lie. But there are a lot of smart people who come to a different conclusion. I believe that the only people sophisticated enough to get information like that are the United States, the Russian Federation, China, France, and Britain. France doesn't have a test site. Britain doesn't have a test site. So you got to look at United States, China, and Russia. And they're already a large strategic threat to each other. Can they really alter the balance? I don't know. My point is that when we speak of verification, it's important to understand that sincere people can both say what they want is effective verification and both agree on the technical facts and disagree on whether that's effective verification because they make different policy judgments. That's related to the continuing delay in the ratification of the CTBT in the United States. It's not the only reason. First thing that the report found was that we could not identify any need for the United States to resume testing in order to maintain a safe and secure stockpile. Only if you believe that there is some fundamentally new kind of nuclear weapon that we might need could you think that maybe you need to test. And nobody can think of what that kind of weapon was. So one of the concerns with the CTBT was someday we're going to need to test. And I think our report argues that that is not technically true. And that's a difference because we now have twice as much experience with no testing. I think many people in the United States will accept that conclusion. There's no constituency for nuclear testing in the United States. The last administration didn't give 5 minutes of thought to doing it. This one didn't. The national laboratories have long since assumed that we'll never test again. Second thing the report said was that we have improved our ability to monitor for underground explosives. It looked in the public version of the report, primarily the international monitoring system. There are some U.S. capabilities, and we looked at those too. And that gets us into the discussion we were just having, that you have to think through what happens at the level that you can't monitor. And there, I think there is likely to be some disagreement. But even though skeptics of the CTBT many of them have found our report technically sound and fair and balanced. Third thing our report did was it talked a little bit about what do we have to do to make the first two things remain true. And, it's a report for governments, and it said spend more money. all reports for governments say spend more money. This talked about particular capabilities that we had to maintain, both in terms of understanding weapons physics and in terms of understanding monitoring. And then finally, it looked at what a really determined cheater could do, what some of the evasion scenarios were. And there it, really in some ways reduces to the previous problems. That there are things that you can do, but the people sophisticated enough to do them are probably the people who already have pretty capable nuclear forces, and so what's the benefit? Whether the report will make a difference, I don't know. Has not so far. The debate on the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty in the United States, to the extent there is a debate, is not a purely technical debate. It's a philosophical debate. Do we trust our security to international agreements operated by bodies that we can't control, or do we trust our security to our own strength? I'm proud of the report. I think it ought to form a basis for action, but whether it will or not, I don't know. Now the report, remember, was a technical report, so there are criticisms of the CTBT which are not technical, and we didn't, the one you hear the most of is that there's not a common understanding of what constitutes a nuclear test. This turns out to matter because it's tied into what can you learn from doing very low level experiments. That's an interesting question. I don't personally think it's nearly as important as some people make it, but it's not the kind of question that we answered. So I think we answered all the technical issues. We didn't answer all the issues. And I think, I am hoping that the report will play a useful role, but I personally think that it's going to be very difficult in the next 4 years to get ratification. Nuclear weapons are uniquely complicated. They involve temperatures that are otherwise found only on the surface of the sun. They involve extremely small units of time. They involve high energy density plasma, and for a long time we've used testing to investigate those different phenomena because it was the only tool that existed. And so we developed an understanding of how to design weapons. But at first it was really an art more than a science, and then it was an empirical science. We knew certain things worked, but we didn't completely understand why. And we had these very elaborate codes, but they had what are called knobs. That is, have to make this adjustment because otherwise the prediction doesn't match the reality. So to get the prediction to match the reality. But whenever you do that, you don't know, if you don't know why, you don't know whether that kind of prediction will hold over all kinds of explosions or just this. So that's where we were with the science in the early 90s. The technical community, as I understand it, I was doing something else at the time, did not see quite how rapidly testing was going to come to an end. Political conditions in the United States sometimes move quickly, and testing ended. And so what the technical community said was, okay, we need this understanding of science, because otherwise we don't know, for example, as weapons get older and older, will the things that we design into them, will they still work that way? In the old days, we could have answered that by saying, we'll do another test and get more data. Now we can't. So the Stockpile Stewardship Program, which was originally called the Science-Based Stockpile Stewardship Program, was a way to take very sophisticated tools and very sophisticated computation and a very thorough look back at all the data from all the tests we'd done in trying to move to a real understanding from theoretical first principles. And it has succeeded pretty well. We put a great deal of money into it. We've had very smart people, but we've also developed tools like this giant laser, the National Ignition Facility, which will replicate the kind of conditions that you could only get in the sun or in a nuclear weapon. Itty bitty thing the size of a pencil eraser, but it'll replicate it and we will be able to gain data. And then a series of other tools. But it also depended on a vast improvement in computing. Now, what our committee said and what other sophisticated review panels like the Jasons said was that we understand from first principles well enough to deal with maintaining the stockpile forever. We can make improvements because, and we understand whether those will make a difference in the performance. There may be some things where we can't understand, but they don't seem right now to be hugely important. If you decided you needed a new type of device that, put all its energy in one direction, or that it's a pure fusion device, or, then we may or may not understand well enough to do that. But as long as we stick to things that are the sons and grandsons of devices we've tested, we understand the science. That's what our report said. And what that means is that we can keep our nuclear arsenal safe, secure, reliable, and effective without nuclear testing for a long time. And that's because of stockpile stewardship. I think the great success of arms control was in capping and then reducing the arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States. But that's been done. I was very proud of Start One. Worked very hard on it. Thought it was a very good agreement. But I'm not sure that arms control in the East-West sense has a major role to play anymore. I think what the world should focus on is reducing the political motives that lead states to acquire nuclear weapons. One random example is Pakistan. Pakistan is always going to be substantially smaller than India. It's always going to look back at the legacy of conventional war and see that it hasn't done very well. And it appears to have a permanent hostility toward India. Now, my government was grumpy when the government of Pakistan tested nuclear weapons in 1998, but you can sort of understand. And I don't think that we are going to, saying that India and Pakistan will only have so many or they'll do some. We have to try and find those two states a relationship like the United States has with France. You know, sometimes we disagree, it's a little prickly, but nobody thinks we're going to go to war. I believe the international community needs to focus now on political settlements rather than hope that arms control will provide some kind of magic bullet. The other argument for arms control is that the non-proliferation treaty is a bargain. And if the haves don't demonstrate that they are committed to disarmament, then the have-nots sooner or later will decide they're not prepared to play anymore. I've become a little skeptical of that argument. That's the argument that was used by Senator Nunn and Secretary Perry and Schultz and Kissinger, that even if abolition ultimately proved impossible, we needed to focus on the goal or to rally support for non-proliferation. I just, I don't see that happening. And I increasingly believe that states acquire nuclear weapons for the same reason they acquire other weapons, because they think they need to for security. And so I personally would rather focus on reducing states' perceived needs for security. Arms control adds transparency, and transparency leads to predictability, and predictability leads to stability. I believe that. But I think we need to focus now much more on the underlying political causes of tension. That's not an entirely popular view, in the various organizations that are here. It's not entirely, it's a very much a non-popular view with the current U.S. administration. But, so I need to stress again, this is just me. This is not the American government.